And if you aren't, I'm always welcome you guys to go ahead and jump in and say things, but if you're not speaking, if you could go ahead and mute yourself just so there's not background noise, that would be super helpful. So kind of to get started, I always like to start with kind of what do you know so far? So my what do you know question for you is, what types of errors have you seen? And so I want you to just either throw in the chat or you can unmute yourself. What's a type of error that you've encountered? You see names for any of your errors. Syntax ones are a big one. No method errors are also a big one. Undefined, yeah, so undefined variables. Name error, that's another type. Argument error. Yes, the unexpected end error. Perfect. Those ones are really frustrating. So you guys have covered most of, I think actually that might be the specific ones that we'll go over, and kind of how to approach each type of those. Because bigger picture, like your labs are going to get more advanced. But at the end of the day, even when you're on more advanced frameworks like Rails, a lot of your errors are going to come down to all of those things you just put in the chat. Syntax, arguments, name errors, no method errors are super common, especially as we get into object-oriented programming. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And really quick, as just another what do we know kind of question, taking a look at this example, and I have altered the spec for this, so things are a little bit different in here. I'm not giving you answers, so if you haven't done this lab yet, you just copy this down. It's not going to be right. I just have to say that. But in this lab, I get this error message, and I know a lot of you guys have probably seen this, and I just wanted to make sure I highlighted this right away, because when this happens, it does turn your test light green. It does not mean that the lab is solved, and I know a lot of you guys have seen that and figured that out. I just like to clarify. What does this mean if you usually see this at the bottom? Does anyone know?
There are no tests?
So there are a few labs that have no tests. So if you, right off the bat, before you add anything, run learn, then probably there are no tests in that lab. If you ran learn and earlier you were actually getting real error messages and then you end up with this message, it means you have some sort of syntax error. And a lot of you guys put in you're missing an end. True, it could be other than missing an end. Like it could be that there's a weird keyword in there it doesn't know how to handle. But at the end of the day, it's a syntax error. So going off of that, we scroll up to our syntax error here. We could see that it tells us that it was expecting an end and we didn't have an end. And just for the sake of it, let's put it in, and I'm going to run this one more time. Because I just want to gather from you guys, and I've talked to a few of you, and some of you guys have already kind of figured this out. But when you are reading error messages, when you are in the Learn Co testing environment, this is not the place you want to focus, like under this failed examples. You always want to scroll up until you get failures and then the individual messages with this. And so this is where you're going to gather your information, and this is going to be the information that we will focus on today. You guys have used the annotation tools before. I want you to go ahead and circle, underline anything in here that might be helpful to solving this error. Anything at all. Okay, we got a lot of things. What else?
Could you just remind me how to annotate? Because I don't.
Oh, yes, yes. So at the top, there's something that says view options. If you kind of move your mouse to the top and then an annotate.
I see it. Thanks.
Oh my gosh, we have the best information in here, which will make some of this go really fast, which will be wonderful. So I want to just point out some of the things that everything you guys have highlighted is absolutely true. So some things that are really useful that I like that we pointed out is, and I'm going to clear it. All of this is really awesome, but I am going to clear it just so we can read it. One thing that I loved is that someone pointed out this part. And the first error message that we're going to focus on today is going to be the no method error. And for a no method error, they are really tricky because there are a whole bunch of things that could cause them. And what is super important is different objects have different methods, as we saw yesterday. And everything in that we see is either going to be either a variable or we're calling a method on an object. And so include question mark is a real method. It is not an undefined method. It is a method that exists in Ruby, but it is not a method that exists for nil class. And so this is a really big hint that somewhere in here, I have a value that's nil. And then I also loved, we had some other really good things that got pointed out here. Someone pointed out this keyword return to say that this should be something that we return and we don't puts. And then what we should have returned also, like what the test is looking for. I also noticed someone commented this whole portion, and this is really useful too, because this is what we call our back trace of how did we end up at this error message. And as we read it, we can follow the track of, okay, on line 62, that was where the error triggered. But we can see before line 62, line 61 was called, and then line 60. But so this is really where our error message happened. And if you guys are sitting there, you might be like, I have no idea why this error message happened because I did this lab and I didn't get an error. I did change what was in the spec so that we would purposefully get this error. So you can use include in yours. But in this case, what it's telling me is because include is for a nil class, at some point, this supply array is nil. Now, we've got a lot of good problem solvers here. And I know a lot of you guys have been really curious about how to use pry well. This might be a point where I go, this isn't working as I expected. My expected output was I did expect supplies array to be an array, not a nil class, that I could call .include on. So what might be something that I could do to check the value of supplies array in the middle of my method running?
Could use binding pry.
Yeah, and where would I put that, Maverick?
At the end of line 62 or right below line 62.
Okay. Oh, my annotate tools are still on. And then if you are going to use binding pry, the other piece that you have to add is at the top, you would scroll up and you would write require and then in quotes pry. It also needs to be in the gem spec, but most of our labs in here automatically include it. We'll see. I might say that and then this one won't have it in here. So then we'll run learn again. Do we think it's going to hit our binding pry? I got one no. Is someone going to say something?
We can put it right before it because the error happens before line 63.
Yes. So to be very honest, it was kind of a trick question. So you always want to put it the line before the error. We did still hit it, but we hit it because we're in an iteration. So this time in our iteration, and the way you tend to use pry is you would check the value of things. So this time in the iteration, we'll hit supplies array and we got information. But in an iteration, binding pry can be a bit tricky to use because it's going to hit your binding pry a bunch. So if we exit this again, like that had a value, it's kind of like, why isn't this working? I can type in supplies array again, check to see if it has a value. It does. Why is this not working? You know, it like seems like everything is working as expected. Still hitting there, and you kind of want to go through these paces of, oh, sorry, it's lagging a lot, so I can't see what it's writing. Okay, so it still is working. Hit exit one more time. We got Turkey. We're really, I think I did, and then it just ends. So I never actually saw the issue or saw my error. But we still did have an error, and it jumped out, and we got this no method error include. And this is the hardest one to solve and know where to put your binding pry, because at the end of the day, there's actually only one like it's going to iterate over. I'll show you what I changed. And that will give you some clarity as to why this isn't working. So here is our hash. And what I changed is Memorial Day, instead of it pointing to an array, I just had it point to nil. I promise you, you will have times, especially in your project and as you move forward in labs, that you'll run into an error like this. But in this one, I did contrive it just so we could see it. And so if you noticed, we successfully were able to look at this array, the party hats array, fireworks, barbecue, turkey, and then it just ended. And it didn't actually let us look at our final array. So a little trick you can do, one, I would always put the binding pry above here. But we were specifically looking for when was include called on a nil class. So at some point, supplies array was nil. So what I like to do with my binding pries, oh, that's not what I meant to do, is I like to add a little condition so that we only stop in the binding pry in our error condition. So I might say if supplies array is equal to nil, then let's stop in my binding pry. And I might just write it like this. And so that way we don't have to stop, we don't have to stop in all of those working examples. We can just stop in the example that doesn't work. And then we can take a look, okay, what was my holiday and what's my supplies array? Because otherwise it gets really annoying to go through all of the things. As a side note, you can, if you're only going to have one condition for an if, it's also possible to write your if to the side. So writing my if statement like this would work the same. So we write a conditional binding pry to only stop on our situation that is causing an issue. And then we would go and solve it. And this one would be a little bit hard to solve, to be honest, because, well, we might have to say something like, if it doesn't equal array, then check to, like if it doesn't equal nil, then check to make sure it includes barbecue. We might have to add some condition to solve it, but this is kind of a contrived example. So I kind of I wanted to give this as the big picture view of what we're looking at today, and then actually specifically go through each type of error message that you'll see and where that should lead you. And I have a lot of slides, but some of them are actually going to go pretty fast. Why is this? Why did this sign me up? Sometimes my computer just does not like to cooperate when I'm on Zoom too. It's okay, we only need it in view only. So we already really have covered the first one, but I do just want to review it really quick. So anytime that we have a no method error, there are basically 4 different reasons that that could be caused. One is you literally could just not have written the method. So when we see undefined method like speak to grandma for our spec, this is just probably saying that this method might not exist yet. Like you haven't actually written it yet for the test. This one is probably the easiest one to get around and solve, so we're gonna skip it pretty fast. Another example, and this is the example we just looked at, is you might be using it for the wrong data type. So upcase, perfectly good method. Actually, in this case, we've got something weird. Upcase even is a method that works for string, but notice what did it, my upcase method is actually listed here as upcase equals. So similar to what, and let me get my annotate tools out, similar to what Avi kind of pointed on yesterday, is there are little minute things that can happen in Ruby that can throw off your code. And so in this case, and I know these are kind of beginner labs, but I think it is helpful. In this case, it was a use of accidentally using 1 equal sign versus 2 equal signs. And so there's this thing that happens where it can actually change the meaning of the method you're trying to call if you accidentally use 1 equal sign versus 2. So you want to check to make sure that all of the code around there is actually working correctly and that you are using that method correctly. Sorry, this keeps jumping ahead of me and my arrow keys are not working. That's okay. The other type of no method error is when we're using it on the wrong data type. A modulo works great for numbers. Why does this keep I'm sorry, guys. There we go. It works great for numbers. It does not work for arrays. And so in a no method error, and this is kind of what I was trying to get at in the get-go, the most important part is that you read this whole message and that you are paying attention to what was the method it tried to call and for what data type. Those two pieces. I know even when you get into Sinatra and Rails, a lot of people read no method errors and they read only this portion of the no method error. And you're gonna miss out on so much information because you probably called the right method, you might have just called it on the wrong data type. And so the whole method is gonna be super important here. And as we continue on in general, that's gonna be like what I challenge you to be your focus is read the entire error message. Never start with part of it. And the message I sent out this morning, kind of just getting on that same thing, you wanna be able to communicate what happened. And so if I was trying to communicate this, I would say, trying to use a method, and for some reason it is trying to use a method that works for an integer, but for some reason it is trying to use it on an array. I'm not sure why my data type is an array when I thought it was an integer. So you wanna give some description to show that you have understood your error message. Okay, moving on. And then finally, the last type is, not the last type, but the last thing you should do with a no method error is actually to follow your error path. And this is what a few of you guys pointed out at the beginning, to just follow what's actually happening, because a lot of times it could be that where the method is being called or invoked from is partly what is calling the issue. So for example, in this method, we have an undefined method songs for artist as an array, and we can follow this method to see our error happened here, but it was a result of where we called that from our initialize. So you kind of want to go line by line by line to take a look at what happened with your errors. With the top one being the most important place to start, but if that's not giving you any hints to what's going wrong, always move to the next one. So if ever you run into a no method error, these 4 checks are what I would recommend going through. Check that you have the method, was it used correctly, and was it used on the correct data type? And reading that whole error message, including your error file path. So most importantly, like Chris and I both feel like there's a lot of value from getting a chance to pair. So I have a challenge for you guys, and I'm gonna put you into breakout rooms. And give you guys a chance to practice this. I don't know why my tools are not working well with me today. And so I'm gonna go ahead and send this out in the chat so you guys have access to it and explain what I'm looking for you to do. It should be fairly quick, and then we'll come back in here. My emphasis is even if you see what's going wrong right away, I would like you to discuss it as a group to use some technical terms of this is what is the error and this is why I think that error is being called, so that you can communicate it to ask a question or to your peers in the future. The first challenge is you're going to run this top part and you'll see some error messages output. I just want you to fix those error messages. Once they're fixed, come down here and comment this in and then try to fix the error messages for this part. So there's 2 different pieces here, and I'm going to put you guys in groups of 3 approximately. It'll be 2 to 3. Okay, so feel free to jump in and I'll give you the signal to come back. So you should, did I assign you to a room, Jesse?
I don't think so. Not yet.
You didn't get a pop-up that says, I'm gonna, it won't let me reassign you. There should be a pop-up somewhere that says breakout room 9.
You're right. You did. I was just, I jumped over to the Replit tab and I wasn't looking at the Zoom tab.
Okay. No worries.
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
didn't get very far.
It's okay if you didn't finish solving it. Different groups were at different places, and I kind of just wanted to bring it back, and we're gonna like finish it up. I'm gonna have a few of different. I'm gonna call on you guys, and I want you to like share what your group found, or at least explain to me what the error message was doing. And I actually see if I can pull up the breakout rooms. Okay, perfect. So when I first ran this, and this first error that I got, what was my issue? And actually, I'm gonna start, Merk, is it okay if I call on you? What was my issue, or how did you solve this very first one?
Okay.
I don't know if you can, Merk, did you hear me? And if you don't want to answer it, it's okay. I can give it to
No,
someone.
I'm sorry. I was
that's okay.
talking and I didn't see the, I was mute. My bad.
That's okay.
But,
what did you do to solve this very first one?
well, Kiki and I ran the, first we ran to see what the problem was. And then we found that the first problem was a typo. It was yells and it should have been yell.
Exactly. So this is
on line 8. What was it? Line 8, right.
perfect. So this is one where you could solve it actually either way. So we could have changed both of these to be yells or both to be yell, but it's just a matter of we didn't define the method correctly. And so perfect, very, very well put. So for this next one, I'm going to pass it to the next group. Burbage and Jesse, what's the error that we're seeing here, and how did you solve it?
Yeah. Hang on. Am I still on mute?
No, I can hear you.
Okay. So you're referring to the class dog one, right?
Oh no, just the second error message that we have
Oh,
here.
okay. I'm sorry. Undefined method of case. So basically what this is saying is that, so we know upcase is a legitimate Ruby method, so that's not the problem. The problem is that it's trying to do it for this array, and that's just not working.
Exactly.
Yeah, so.
And so there's a lot of ways to solve this, and I didn't really specify in there. You could have like iterated over the array. We could have joined the array to turn it into a string. At even a bare bones, we probably could have transformed it to a string. But in some way, it has to turn into a string for us to call upcase. So this is one where, yes, you would have to fully read that whole method for it to come out. Yes, exactly, Alex. Upcase is just for springs. Perfect. So then we've passed our first one. For the second one, I threw in a lot of issues in here, and I'm not sure who all got to this part or not. It's okay if your group didn't. So if I call on your group and you guys didn't get here, just go ahead and tell me that. Breakout room 7, Wally, Alex, and Kevin. Did you guys figure out what was the issue in this first? We see upcase still isn't working here. Why is upcase not working in this method?
I think this is where we stopped.
Okay. Do you happen from reading this message, can you tell what the issue is?
It has something to do with the Barks method.
Mm-hmm. And you are free to pass if you want to, but you are right. It has to do with this Barks method, which we can see if we follow our backtrace here.
Mm-hmm.
And then we can see on line 25, something is not working. And so
Sure.
that's totally fine. So this is another case where like reading the whole error message can be really useful because upcase is a legitimate Ruby method. But right now we're trying to call it on nil class. And that means that whatever we put right before upcase is representing nil. So at the moment, at name is nil.
Okay, we didn't define it yet.
Yeah,
I was
exactly.
going to say the Barks is being called before the name is being assigned. Toby's assigned.
Exactly. Yeah, and I see Jesse put that in there too. So there's a few ways to solve this. if you follow the challenge directions, you would not want to just like move this, because I actually did want our dog to bark first without a name and then to bark with a name. But that would actually get us past that method. I think I saw one group that figured out a way to make it flexible so that this will work even when name is nil. Is there a group out there that did figure that out and wants to share?
We did.
Okay,
We did.
Mike, do you want to share what you guys did?
Yeah, right after line 24 there, we did a conditional if statement. So if at name is nil, we just puts I am dog, and then else puts the name upcase.
Perfect. So we still are doing something, but this way at least we have a condition where it's only doing that if it's not nil. So now we see woof woof, I am dog. Perfect. I like it. This next method error is one that you guys might see a lot as you start moving into object-oriented programming. Undefined method name equals for our dog instance, and this error is happening on line 35. Any groups want to take a stab as to why that's happening on line 35? Any groups I haven't called on? So maybe, I don't know if you guys got this far, Albert, Jess, and Nithelbert.
Oh, sure. Yeah, we definitely did. So we thought of a few different ways. We thought about just creating a setter for it, or just creating the adder assessor and just getting rid of everything else.
Okay.
That's kind of like the step that we went with. So we went ahead on line 18, we put in adder assessor.
That's probably the easiest way to do it.
Yeah, it's fairly simple. in that
Why am
way.
I not able to spell today? Adder assess. I still can't. Why? I'm blanking, guys, on how to spell this. Adder assessor.
ATTOR, yes.
I don't know where my brain was going. But so this is going to build out a name equals method as well as a name method. And so now we actually wouldn't need either of those. Nice job. And that will go ahead and pass those for you. And now we have no errors. So looks great. Nice job, guys. I will tell you, no method errors are the trickiest errors in my opinion, and they are the ones that are most common. You will continue to see them in every section that you go through. And the biggest piece of advice I can give is just look at that for no method error for. What is it a no method error for? Obviously, those aren't the only kind of errors, and I do want to make sure we get through these. Some of these we're going to like move a little bit quicker through. One error you guys mentioned was an argument error. These are another ones that are really, really common. And so one thing I just want to point out that can be a little confusing. In other tests, expected is what the test is expecting. You know, they'll have like expected and this is what it got. For argument errors, it's the reverse. In an argument error, given is what the test or you gave when you called the method. Expected is actually what your method was built out to expect. So it just is a little bit of a flip-flop of the way you want to think about it. And so it's useful to pay attention in this error message here. The most useful part that you're going to have is this statement to tell you how many the test was giving and how many you actually gave to the method. And then some other things that are useful here as well. Always this next line in blue is going to be useful. It tells you the line that this is happening on. And then it tells you the method that that has the wrong number of arguments. And then this is another case where the backtrace is what we call it, is really useful because it will also tell you where our mismatch is. So the first line is going to be the line that is expecting arguments. So this is like where we're expecting. And the second line is the line that's giving the arguments. So if we were to go look at the spec, line 3, we would see speak to grandma called with 1 argument. And if we were to look at line 15, we would see speak to grandma defined with 0 arguments. And you're not going to be able to change the spec. So if your spec is giving something different than how you've defined it, you would want to adjust that. there will become cases, and you might have experienced it, especially with tic-tac-toe, or times where you call your own methods, where it could be that you could alter either line, where the first line and the second line are both code that you wrote. Jesse, let's hear your question.
Yes, quick question. It's actually based on the very first example we were doing, the whole holiday supplies. From my understanding, the argument error also applies to code blocks. And as you were iterating through those, at a certain point, once you reach the level, the desired level of nesting that you wanted to, of course, you have to identify the key and the value. But I think you only use if I remember the value, you only added the value to, the rest of the code. So why is it that in that scenario, it doesn't return an argument method when you're not actually identifying or using both arguments from the code block?
Yeah, good question. So in the pipes, you still have to define both of them because it is built out so that the first method, the first argument that you define is a key and the second one is a variable.
Okay.
But you don't, it's actually similar to a method. Like I could pass in 3 arguments to a method, but my method doesn't actually have to use those arguments inside of the method.
Okay, so whenever we're defining them, it's just a matter of putting them inside the code block, or I'm sorry, the pipelines, but not actually in the rest of the the do portion.
Exactly. Just because it doesn't know how to, otherwise it would take your only argument as a key, even though you meant it to be a value. Like it's just expecting that. Great question.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, glad you brought that up. So going on to the next part, as we can see, this is kind of where I was talking about, this is our one that we are expecting, and the test is actually the one that's giving it. So that's where you would fill in or how you would solve that. The other type of error that we've actually kind of seen a little bit in a different way is a type error. And this is, it actually is very similar to our no method error when we try to call something on the wrong type. Like, so when we try to use dot include on an array, like dot include on like an integer, that doesn't work. But it also works if we try to pass in the wrong thing, or we try to use a method on a data type that doesn't work. Courtney, I just see your question. I want to be able to answer it. Do you mean about the key values or?
Yeah, I felt like that was something that I was running into, but I just wanted to make sure, maybe a simple example in REPL, just so I could just make sure it's just connected with maybe anything that I was encountering.
Yeah.
Well,
so, for example, if we have like a hash that has, let's just say like, we'll have fall pointing to, I'm trying to make this simple, but surely it ends up not being. Fall is going to point to Labor Day, we'll say. And then we wanted to iterate over that array, or not array, hash. Because it's a hash, we have to define 2 things in the pipes, and you can end up with an argument error if you only try to define 1. So if we only tried to define the season, or if we only tried to say, well, let's put the holiday here, we would end up with an argument error, because when it's a hash that we're iterating over, there are 2 things that we care about in the iteration: the key fall and the value Labor Day. And so in our pipes, we have to always define both a key and a value, or we get an argument error. But in the method, it's okay if we only use the value. Like, we don't necessarily have to use both things that are defined. Does that kind of make sense, Courtney? And that might be different than what you were thinking.
Yes, thank you. No, yeah, it was different, but that's cool. Thank you.
Okay. I'm glad we still touched upon it, because I think it is useful. And actually, it might be a little easier to work in the REPL for the type error. So type error is something like, just like we saw, you can't do like, what's a good example here? We couldn't do like 4 dot upcase. I just use upcase because it's easy. But a type error is a little bit more when we are trying to, like maybe we have hello and we try to divide it. We try to divide it by 2. Like we're trying to do something that doesn't work, and it wouldn't work in real life. And like, you're never going to write code that says this, but as soon as we put those into variables, it gets a little bit harder. So especially a good example is maybe someone has $100 and then you want to give them a deposit of 10. You might be like, oh yeah, I can just say that the total equals my dollars plus my deposit. Without realizing that these are actually 2 different types. And so this is where you run into that type error, and this is where we would end up having that type error. So if we go ahead and run this, we get no implicit conversion of integer into string. It's basically saying it can't do the addition you're doing because you're doing it with 2 different data types. So the key parts of this is to pay attention to, it will always list both of the data types that you're using. So here it lists that we were dealing with both an integer and a string. And so that's where you want to know which one do I need to actually change to get to work. And then the example we were looking at here, include is a really tricky one because sometimes I try to pass in an array to include, and include cannot accept an array as an argument. It needs to accept a string or a number or something like that. And so that's another issue where include gets used incorrectly, where that would have to be reversed.
Yeah, actually the question about that, I was actually trying to figure out how to like write code that tells you if an array is included inside another array, and I wasn't sure how to do that because include didn't work.
So if an array is included inside of another array, like, do you mean like literally like you have an array that has nested arrays inside of it?
No, like if I had an array like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I wanted to see if 3, 4, 5 was included. In another array that was 3, 4, 5, and I'm like, want to be like, is 3, 4, 5 inside of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5?
Gotcha. So you, in that case, you have to do some iteration no matter what. So you might have to do something like if here is our array 1 is going to be equal to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we maybe just wanted to see if there was anything similar between array 2, which maybe was 4, 6, 7, 8. You would need to choose one of them to iterate over, and I would choose the smaller one to iterate over if you know which one's going to be smaller. And then what you would have to do is the other one you can now use include. And you could pass in the number. And instead of this being an each, it could be a detect or a find all. It depends what you're looking for in that situation. Or a map or something like that if you just wanted to find the things that were the same in those. But essentially, you have to, one of them is going to have to be iterated over because include will not accept an array.
Right.
So I know that was not probably the answer you wanted, but.
No, that's cool.
Yeah.
I guess I'm still wondering, like this would work if we want to find the one element that's shared between them, but I still don't really know how it would work if I want to find like if 3 elements in a row are the same as the 3 elements in a row in another array. But we don't have to talk about that now. I can just come back during office hours or something.
Okay, yeah. That would be, it is a cool, like interesting experiment, and there's a lot of different ways you can look at it. So bring that back during office hours because that'll be a fun thing to go over. Cool. So we're almost done kind of going over the different data types, and there's a few that I think I just want to make sure we get covered because they're really important. And then the last part, the name error, you'll see often similar to no method error, but typically it's dealing with when you've used a variable that's undefined. So if ever you see this, it just means that you actually need to go ahead and define that variable. So you're using a word that doesn't have any value, that hasn't shown up in your code yet as having value, and it will always tell you what that word is. And again, it will always tell you what line that's happening And so here's your error message. This is the most important part of that name error. Syntax errors are in some ways my favorite, but they're also the most annoying. They're my favorite in that usually it just takes like an end or a curly bracket or a quote to fix it. They're my least favorite in that actually the error message can be a little bit unhelpful sometimes. So to dissect this error message, we first are going to see the line that triggered the error. I have to give you caution, and I will show you an example of this in a second. That line is typically the error of syntax, like the syntax error might actually not happen on the line that's causing the syntax error. So if you left off an end way up at the beginning, it might not realize that it was missing an end until it got to the very end of your code. So it is really, really possible that you're going through and you're thinking that everything that you're like, that line 18 is where you need to add an end. It's possible that that is not the case. And so I just want to make you aware of that and warn you of that. It does tell you if it's a syntax error. This is basically the more detailed description. And the last part and the most important is what you need to add. So if it says expecting keyword end, you need to add an end. If it says expecting a curly bracket, you need a curly bracket somewhere. And so that part in and of itself can be really useful. But I want to show you an example. So here's a really good example of this code down here. Notice it calls out line 6 as the issue. Is line 6 where I was actually missing something?
No, line 2.
Yeah, and so this one's easier because it's like a string, and string changes all the colors of your thing, but it actually does the same with an end. So we can run into issues as well where like potentially, and I don't know off the top of my head because I don't have this up, but if I didn't have the end on line 3, a lot of times it still will just tell you the end of your program is missing an end. So we'll say line 7 is missing an end, which is why it's really important, and most of you guys I've met with are doing this already, but to make sure you're indenting, and that anytime you have an orange keyword word, that you can draw a direct connection to an end, and that any of the code that's inside of it gets pushed to the middle, because it helps you to identify these syntax errors. And notice this one even says expecting keyword end, which is a bit tricky because we aren't actually missing an end, we're actually missing a quote. And we needed this to be ended up here. So your computer gives you the least helpful messages with syntax errors, but usually it's just something that you forgot to close off. So you would want to check that any sort of punctuation, parentheses, brackets, quotes, any orange keywords, def, if, do, have their matching close or end piece in syntax errors. And then finally, the last part that I want to get to, because I promise you guys we won't go over, is when it's not matching the test. And there are 2 things that I think are really useful to know about not matching the test, and this, you will move past this at one point, but one is whether or not it's looking for a puts or a return. And my main key that I would like to tell you, and whether or not it's looking for a puts versus a return, is there are 2 pieces. One, if you ever see 2 equals, it is looking for a return value. If you are getting nil and it's looking for 2 equals, you are probably doing a puts when you should be doing a return, because return will always fill in that got section. The next part is if it is actually looking for a puts, what you'll see instead is you will always see this 2 stdout or stdout somewhere in the test. That's not what I was trying to do. This line right here, that is your hint that it is looking for you to either print or puts. And usually the instructions will also tell you that, but I just want to make that clear if you have any trouble kind of going through those 2 pieces. And then the last, where was I? The one other piece that I want to take a look at, because this is going to be more similar to what you guys are doing in object-oriented right now, is I see a lot of outputs like this when you start getting into object-oriented Ruby, where one of these is what the test is expecting and one is what we output. Is the red or the green what we output?
The green is what we output.
Everyone agree?
I think
Yes,
it might be red
agree.
because it's wrong.
So it gets really confusing as you go through this. I'm not gonna lie.
It's the blue.
Great answer, Kenneth. So actually my terminal might be different because this was on my local terminal, so it could have been a trick question. But what's happening here is the plus was what it was looking for, and the minus was what we output instead that was different. And then what is the difference between these two? Because they look almost identical to me.
An array within an array.
Yeah, two more brackets.
Yeah, so this is, I'm showing you this example in particular because it is one of the most common mistakes as you go through object-oriented Ruby. And oftentimes it's the result of paying really a close attention to return values when you save or create an instance. Because what happened was when I created the instance, my return value was at all, because I added it to at all. And so now my array of all the songs includes an array of all the songs. And so we end up with this double nesting. And it's probably the most common error that I see in general. And finally, man, we're gonna end perfectly on time. Finally, this last part, this is a really big slide, and I would encourage you to kind of look at it on your own a little bit. We just focus on errors, but it could be that you're like, okay, I have no errors and I still don't know how to solve this, or I have no errors, but it's still outputting something different than what the test is expecting, and I'm not sure what to do. At that moment, you guys become scientists. You are in a lab experimenting. Your code can be run as many times as possible. You do not get charged the number of times you hit learn. So the advice that we give you in general is you want to follow kind of a scientific approach. So think about, what are you trying to do with your code? Is that happening in your code? If yes, perfect, you've succeeded. If not, think about what is happening instead and try your best to give a hypothesis as to why that's happening instead. And then you can go ahead and test out that hypothesis by making one minor change. So like maybe your hypothesis is, I need a period, and then it will match the output directly. Try adding a period and hit run again. And if that doesn't solve it, then we go back to the drawing board. I want to emphasize, like, when you are in that point of you're kind of stuck, make one small change at a time. You don't need to change all of your code and hit learn. You can do one piece at a time to see how it goes. You are not someone who has to write your code perfectly the first time. No one really does that. There's always room for you to hit learn, get an error, work from that, get another error, work from that, and continue in this process of trying to make a hypothesis about why your code is working the way it does, and then actually make a change based on that hypothesis and test out if that solves your issue. And you kind of just follow this procedure over and over and over again until it works. Any kind of general questions or things that you were hoping that I covered that I didn't cover that maybe we can bring up in office hours or something? Any last burning questions from you guys? Also, I'm going to go ahead and share this out if I can get out of my presentation mode. There we go. Just in case you want to take a look at it. Come on. And will someone quickly click on that and just make sure you can see it?